and I'll turn it over to Al now. Thanks.
Okay, well, good morning. I'd like to begin by emphasizing this word private. We have some people here with military and commercial flying experiences and backgrounds, and my recreational flying is pretty tame compared to all that. But I had a lot of fun with it, so I thought I'd share it with you. So people have been interested in flying probably for as long as we've been human. The Chinese have had flying tops for hundreds, perhaps thousands of years. And Leonardo da Vinci developed an ornithopter in the 1400s. He developed the plans for it. He never actually built it. So I've been interested in flying for a long time. As a youngster, I used to fly in my dreams. And I didn't need an airplane or any other device. I'd just be up and away and look down on the neighborhood. It was great fun. So first successful effort to get off the ground was in Versailles. It was in a hot air balloon, and they went up to 4,000 or 5,000 feet, and we're still flying hot air balloons. Gliders were over 100 years later. A fellow named Octavia Chanute was flying gliders successfully, as was Otto Lilienthal. And he wrote up his results. I'll give you the English: bird flight as a basis of aviation. Somebody else can handle the German. But he wrote up his results, which were a great help to the Wright brothers. This is the Wright brother glider in 1902 when they were working out the control system. They did a huge amount of trial and error and research and everything. And they built their own wind tunnel because some of the information they got was not correct, and so they developed their own. Gliders have become a lot more efficient. Some of the best now have a glide ratio of 70 to 1. That's 70 feet forward for every foot you drop, which is fantastic. And we also have hang gliders, which are more available to everyone. You don't need a license, and so on. And so they're quite popular, also pretty dangerous. Well, the Wright brothers were high school dropouts, but that doesn't mean they were uneducated. They grew up in a house full of books, in a family that really valued reading, and they did a lot of homework. They wrote to the Smithsonian Institution saying, "Give me everything you've got on flight." And there were a lot of unsuccessful attempts at flight, and many of them quite naive. I'll give you just a bit. Interestingly, these folks that were doing the early flight thought they were doing something important. So a lot of them left videos or photos in the earlier days. I like the dog in this. It's having a great time. So it looks like he survived. Well, these unsuccessful attempts went on, and Everything changed in 1903.
On December 17, 1903, the history of aviation was changed forever when the Wright brothers made the world's first successful flight. You might think that their design was so simple. The propellers move the aircraft forward, the wings produce the lift, and the aircraft stays in the air. But when you examine it closely, you will be amazed by the numerous ingenious technologies these high school dropouts developed 100 years ago. First things first, to make an aircraft fly, you have to first overcome the pull of gravity, or, in other words, you have to produce a lift force. The Wright brothers borrowed the idea of lift generation from their own earlier experience on gliders. They knew that when air flowed over a curved surface, it generated a lift force. The higher the speed, the more would be the lift force. An increase in angle of attack also increased the lift force. To make the aircraft move forward, two propeller blades were used. They produced thrust force, again from the same airfoil principle. However, the Wright brothers proved that to work efficiently in air, a high-speed, narrow blade was the ideal choice. Moreover, you will notice that the blades were rotating in opposite directions. This was another crucial design decision. Without this, control of the aircraft would not have been possible. Blades were driven by an engine which sat on the wing. To fly an aircraft, you have to obey the following force equations of flight. To come up with an aircraft design which satisfied these equations, the Wright brothers developed their own lift data by abandoning all the wrong lift data that was available at that time. The Wright brothers' wing had the top point near the leading edge. This design produced much more lift than the top at center design used at that time. The Wright brothers realized that the existing heavy automobile engines being used were the main villains. They had to make the engine lighter without compromising its power output. Only a powerful engine could give the aircraft a good speed. As explained earlier, the more the speed, the more the lift. Unable to find any such engine, with the help of their mechanic, the Wright brothers designed and built their own engine, a lightweight 12-horsepower petrol engine. Before the new engine development, the Wright brothers had calculated that they needed an engine of less than 200 pounds in weight, with at least 8 horsepower to meet the equations of flight. To reduce weight, they even cast the crankcase with aluminum, a first at that time. They painted the crankcase black so that their competitors would not know about the construction material. You can see the details of the chain and sprocket mechanism used to transfer power from the engine to the propeller blades. With this design, at proper airplane speed, the lift force would overtake the gravitational pull and they would have takeoff. Did you notice a rail track in this visual? That was another clever design decision from the Wright brothers. They knew that it was impossible to get a good airplane speed in the sandy terrain, so they used a 60-foot-long rail track arrangement for a smooth takeoff. The Wright brothers' main innovation was the development of successful flight controls. Aircraft crashes were a common issue in those days, and nobody knew how to control them. To have a successfully controlled flight, the Wrights had to control their plane in 3 axes: pitch, roll, and yaw. To pitch the airplane, the Wright Flyer had an elevator arrangement at the front. You can see that by moving this lever, a rope mechanism changed the angle of the elevator. If the elevators rotated up, there would be an upward lift force as per the airfoil principle. The torque produced by this lift force could push the whole aircraft up as shown. To push the aircraft nose down, they just did the reverse. To roll the aircraft, Wilbur Wright had a great idea: wing warping. It was clear that by twisting the wing along its length at one end, the angle of attack would be positive and the other end it would be negative. This would obviously create a lift differential and the airplane would roll. To understand how the Wright brothers practically achieved the wing warping, let's have a look at this animation. The pilot controls a cradle using his hip, which in turn controls 2 separate cables attached to it. The cable movement makes the wing warp through a clever mechanism. However, when the Wright brothers first tried to roll the aircraft using wing warping, the result was disastrous. They noticed that along with the rolling, the airplane took an unintended turn as shown. They called it a steering reversal problem. This phenomenon is now called adverse yaw. The Wright brothers overcame this issue with the help of a rudder arrangement. If the aircraft was yawing in this way, they turned the rudder as shown, in such a way that the torque produced by the rudder would exactly cancel the adverse yaw torque. Here, the Wright brothers made another smart move. Since the rudder had to be operated whenever there was wing warping, they connected the rudder and wing warping controls together. Both these motions were simultaneously operated from the hip control. By using these controls effectively, the Wright brothers were able to give the aircraft the stability needed, pitch the aircraft to climb up or climb down, and make a smooth turn by banking the aircraft.
Well, you've just had Aeronautics 101. In 1909, a Frenchman, Louis Blériot, designed the first monoplane and put the control surfaces at the rear, which is the way it's now done. And he won a prize by flying across the English Channel. And we'll come back to flying across the Channel in a little while. World War I accelerated the development of airplanes, at first only for reconnaissance, and the Allied and German pilots would sort of wave at each other as they passed. And then they realized, no, we're enemies, so they started carrying pistols and shooting at each other. And before long, they were mounting machine guns and getting into dogfights. At first, the Germans had superior aircraft in what was known as the Fokker Scourge. And then later, the Allies got better aircraft and restored their air superiority. After the war, pilots with surplus military planes were starting to go out and do barnstorming, county fairs and so on, and they'd do loops and other daring do. These guys playing tennis on the top wing of the plane, and so on. And World War II, again, really accelerated the development of aircraft. So some were the Japanese Zero, the German Messerschmitt, both formidable fighter planes. Some of ours, the P-40, known as the Flying Tiger in some places, P-17, Flying Fortresses, and P-38, a number of others. Well, late in the war, we began to realize that the Germans were developing a jet-propelled fighter, and we were desperate to beat them to it. And so this resulted in the first jet-propelled fighter used by our military in that war, the Lockheed P-80, Shooting Star, they called it. But Pearl Harbor, the Japanese showed us the effectiveness of carrier-based aircraft. One of ours was the famous Corsair, the F-4U, had inverted gull wings so that you could put a heavy engine and a big propeller higher above the deck. Also had folding wings, so we could store more of them on a flight deck. There was the issue of the sound barrier, and it was finally broken in 1945 by an experimental plane, and it went over 1,000 miles an hour. It was carried to altitude first by another plane so that they could conserve fuel, use it all for their acceleration. Went over 1,000 miles an hour, well over the speed limit, which is about 760 miles per hour at sea level, and about 100 miles per hour less at 11,000 feet. Well, the problem with the sound barrier is that when you've got something moving through the air, it generates sound waves. And if it's moving at the same speed as the speed of sound, the waves stack up into standing waves. And this really messes up the control surfaces, and there were a number of accidents, some fatal, of people trying to break through the sound barrier. I don't know the physics of it, but by tapering the fuselage from front to back in a so-called Coke bottle design, it makes it easier to go through the barrier. And so the plane at the left is supersonic, but the plane at the right carries a lot more paying passengers. And so supersonic flight with a Concorde and so on never was really commercially viable. I think this is an artist rendition rather than one that was actually built. Another major development in aviation was development of the helicopter. Igor Sikorsky, who it turns out grew up in the Ukraine, which is in the news pretty much now, developed his first flying model when he was, that was before the Wright brothers. It was powered by rubber band and probably pretty much like these Chinese tops. But like the Wrights, he knew he had to have a heavy or a light engine to get enough power to get off the ground okay. And there was no such engine available. He didn't develop his own like the Wrights, and so he had to wait for the technology to catch up with him. But 1939, he had developed the first controllable helicopter. There were other attempts, but they just couldn't really control them. And he demonstrated it by landing it in a designated spot in a parking lot. A year later, in 1940, the Army bought its first and gave him a $50,000 contract. And to understand that in current money, you have to move the decimal over a couple of places. At first, they couldn't go very high, maybe 7,000 feet service ceiling, because there just wasn't enough power. Now with turbines, they can go a lot higher. And so this lady has a reputation, does high altitude rescues in Nepal, and has the record. She rescued at a climber camp at 6,200 meters above sea level. That's 20,000 feet, and new record. Those of you in the military can look at her shoulder boards and the bars there. I can't tell if it's 3 bars or 2.5, but that's pretty high ranking. It kind of crushes my stereotype of, oh, Nepal's a third world place where the women are treated like property and can't amount to anything. Well, this kind of belies that. Now, of course, there are lots of different kinds of helicopters. The huge Chinook, still flying around now, was used a lot in Vietnam. About a month ago, Phil Condit, former CEO of Boeing, gave a talk on the future of flight. And first he debunked the idea that we'd all have our personal flying vehicles, saying the air control problem would just be unimaginable. There's just no way you could do that. And he has had the same idea for maybe smaller things like taxi cabs that could maybe hold 6 people. Again, you couldn't put many in the air, you'd have a nightmare. He also had quite a bit to say about fuels. There's a lot of hype about clean burning hydrogen. And he said this is mostly illusory, that hydrogen is an energy carrier, not a fuel. It takes energy to create it. You get some of it back when you burn it, but the source of that energy may or may not be clean. And if you've watched the news, the infrastructure bill has a lot about clean burning hydrogen. And maybe this is hype, maybe not, don't know. So let me now go to 2 of my aviation heroes, Burt Rutan and Paul McCready. Rutan developed a lot of really innovative aircraft. And like the Wright brothers, he put the control surface, the elevator, up front. Because in a conventional design now, the elevator actually has a downward force to counteract the weight of the engine. And that can be important. So he put it up front. One of his designs was the Very-Ease. I don't know if this shows up there. Yeah. But the stabilizer is up front in the elevator. And this downward force is really important. It's now pretty much accepted that the reason for the crash of the de Havilland Eider near Whidbey Island a while ago was that they'd lost the elevator. And without the downward force, it pitched forward into a nosedive, and that's exactly what observers had seen. Rutan also developed the Voyager, which was the first and only plane to fly around the world without refueling or without landing. His brother Dick Rutan flew it with partner Gianna Wagar, and it took them 9 days in a tiny little cabin. They got back to California apparently when it was still dark, and so they circled it for a while, hoping they'd get a reception something like Lindbergh got when he crossed the Atlantic. But apparently it was sort of a ho-hum, low-key reception, and not too many people showed up. Yeah, just a big deal. I mean, you flew around the world, so what type of thing. He also, with partner Paul Allen, got involved in a thing to develop the first commercial flight into space with a human cargo. And yeah, like the experimental plane earlier, it was carried aloft by a mothership that they call the White Knight. And it was rocket propelled. Here it is going into space. It had a unique re-entry design. Instead of flying, it just folded and dropped most of the way back to Earth. And this is really important because to date, all the vehicles coming back into space were coming in at about 25,000 miles per hour, and the friction was just horrendous in the heat. And of course, the Columbia burned up and killed all the astronauts in 2003. My other aviation hero is Paul McCready, who developed the first human-powered aircraft. McCready was building model airplanes from age 7 on, and you could buy them in that time for 10 cents at the dime store. And by age 16, he had won several national championships for model building, or flying models. And then he went on to become an aeronautical engineer, and he won soaring championships in both the US and Europe. So he was a rather unique individual to be studying human-powered flight. I don't understand the physics of it, but by observing vultures and other soaring birds and timing how long it took them to go around a circle, he could compute the wing loading and how much power it would take to keep them aloft in still air. And so he began computing how much wing it would take to carry a human and how much power it would take, and found that with proper design, you needed something like a quarter horsepower, I think, which was within human capability if you had a really well-trained athlete. So he thought, there's this Kremer Prize, I'm going to try for that. And in 1959, British industrialist Henry Kremer offered a prize of 50,000 British pounds, then equivalent to about 98,000 US dollars, for the first person or group that could fly an airplane in a measured mile around a figure-8 course. There were planes that would get off the ground and go some distance, some over a mile, but they couldn't turn. So that was the big challenge. Oh, here's the course.
The rules for winning are quite strict. A man-powered plane must take off by itself. It must reach a height of 10 feet at the beginning of the course. It must make a complete left turn and a right turn. It must clear the same 10-foot height again at the end.
McCready, instead of focusing on a very clean aircraft, figured if I make it slow enough, we won't have much drag from the extra stuff like bracing wires and so on. And so he put together the Gossamer Condor, and that was the first successful flight. The ground rule was that if it breaks, make it stronger. If it doesn't break, make it lighter. Very quick and dirty approach. And the plane was mostly aluminum framework with mylar covering.
On August 23rd, 1977. Their 10th official attempt. 30 a.m., the breeze stills. of painful evolution, it is now a sophisticated aircraft, generations removed from the simple structure they once thought would easily win the prize. The Gossamer Condor swings its huge wing around the first turn with ease. Six minutes and 2 turns later, the only obstacle left is the 10-foot finish pole. Man-powered flight has become a reality.
You notice the bicycle guy there, he was a champion bicycle racer and a superb athlete. But they computed that the average person, even in tip-top physical shape, just couldn't generate enough sustained energy to do that sort of thing. In 1979, this guy, Kremer, wanted to give a bigger challenge, so he offered 100,000 British pounds for the first group that could fly across the English Channel in a human-powered aircraft. And in less than a year, McCready and a team had developed the Albatross and were able to do this.
A ground speed of nearly 10 miles per hour, closely attended by his teammates and Zodiacs off each wing, he follows a course southeast to the French coast at Cap Grenet. Now, approaching midpoint, Brian begins to encounter increasing headwinds.
It appears that the fuselage is starting to steam up a little bit. Does it look like it's going to be any sort of a problem for you? I think it will be a problem now.
He still pedals at a steady 75 revolutions per minute. His decreasing ground speed means that the estimated 2-hour flight time is no longer possible. Against the relentless headwind, the Albatross's ground speed has been cut to approximately 7 miles an hour. For Brian, the flight has become a grinding ordeal. After an hour and 45 minutes, still more than 7 miles from France, he signals defeat. He can go no farther. He must be towed the rest of the way. Obediently, one of the Zodiacs closes in, ready to attach a fishing rod to the fuselage for the tow. But as Brian struggles upward to allow the Zodiac to come underneath, he suddenly waves off his rescuers. At 15 feet, he has found less turbulence, decides to push on. Numbly, Brian pedals on, no longer counting time. His flight instruments no longer function, and his water supply is exhausted. When at last he sights the French coast through the haze, his heart sinks. It is still 3 miles away. For Brian, each moment now has become a victory. Dehydrated, suffering severe leg cramps, his judgment has begun to waver. Briefly, he considers crashing on the rocky point. Instead, he fights to save the Albatross from the turbulence that claws at it and nearly wrecks it a few feet offshore. Then slowly, at last, it is done.
I like the music there getting to a crescendo as he's approaching there. The Albatross was a much larger airplane. It had a wingspan 3 times that of the Gossamer Condor. It was almost the length between the goal lines of a football field, something like 297 feet, which is phenomenal. And they gave up this quick and dirty, if it breaks, make it stronger and so on. They got really meticulous about their design, had really a talented team putting things together. And among other things, they made the main frame out of carbon fiber instead of aluminum. But nobody was making carbon fiber tubing long enough, so they built their own, developed their own. And it was interesting, they'd wrap it with this resin carbon fiber mix and around an aluminum tube. And then they'd put the whole thing in a vat and dissolve out the aluminum, which was way too heavy. And so they had this fantastically light material. And so the Gossamer Albatross weighed the same as the Condor, 70 pounds. And later, McCready went on and designed the Solar Challenger, totally powered by photovoltaic cells on the wings and on the very large stabilizer back here. And it, with a pilot, took off, flew 160 miles, got up to 14,000 feet. They thought during the summer solstice it could have gone higher because they had the energy. As I mentioned, the people doing this stuff thought it was pretty important and got records made. And so McCready took on a historian to document the whole thing, which he did in a book, which is very detailed, called The Gossamer Odyssey. And the author, Morton Grosser, said this could only happen in Southern California for 2 reasons. First, all the materials and technologies and talented personnel were available there. And second, the culture was right, which is kind of fascinating. He cites a CEO of another small corporation visiting, and this kid came in and said, "Hey, what do we do next?" And McCready told him, and he said, "No, that's dumb." And okay, what would you do? And that sounded pretty good. So okay, go do that. Well, this visiting CEO got so upset by the insubordination, he got up and left. He couldn't handle that. Well, as Andrews mentioned, I'd been interested in flying for a long time, and I was building model airplanes, again available for 10 cents at the dime store. Mostly interested in getting things that would actually fly rather than representatives of real aircraft. My first flight ever was in a Grumman Widgeon up in Juneau. We were on a midshipman training cruise up there and decided to take a flight up over the Mendenhall Glacier. I was in the Navy and driving past the local airport, I saw planes in the air. I thought, I'd like to do that sometime. So I went in. Lessons were offered. I checked it out with the idea that I might want to learn to fly sometime. But before leaving the airport, I took my first lesson in a 65 horsepower Aeronica Champ. Here's a bit of what it was like. Well, I was on a ship based in Norfolk, Virginia that never went anywhere. We'd go out to sea and shoot at drone aircraft, even had guided missiles for a while. I was really itching to get transferred to a ship that would go somewhere. Instead, I got transferred to shore duty, Atlantic Fleet Headquarters, right in Norfolk. But it gave me more time to go flying, and so I bought an airplane, a Luscombe, Cost me $875. Beautiful little airplane. It was still minimum, no electrical system, no radio, no lights. 65 horsepower, but it was all metal. It cruised at 90 miles an hour instead of 65 like the Aeronautica Champ. If I washed and waxed it, it would go 95 miles an hour. So I had a lot of good time with this. I flew home to Colorado, and it was more than a one-day flight, so I was prepared to camp. Just pitched the tent right under the wing. And when I got home, I gave my mom a flight first. And then my dad was pretty husky, and by the time we went, it had warmed up. And so the air that was already thinner at our elevation of 5,000 feet was even thinner. Well, the 65 horsepower were great at sea level, but up at 5,000 feet, they just barely got us over the fence at the far end of the field. Well, when I left the Navy, I had both an old Ford and an airplane. But I always wanted to see Everglades National Park, and so I headed south, flew down to Florida. Part of it along the Florida coast, and then I was kind of spooked by the heavy aircraft at Miami International. And so I went on to a small airport at Homestead, a lot closer to the park. But no rental cars or bicycles, and getting to the park, which is still 60 miles away, was another adventure story. But I flew over the Keys, and film didn't do justice to all the shades of blue and green that you could see. Went as far as Key West. Cuba was only another 50 miles, but I didn't like the idea of flying over open water. Engine always ran a lot rougher when I didn't have a safe landing opportunity. Clouds are beautiful, but in the distance you can see one with an anvil shape on top. That's a thunderhead. And that was good warning, I better get back on the ground. Well, from Florida, I flew back home to Colorado, crossing the southeastern United States. I wish I had a photo, but there were hundreds of little pits. And in Colorado, those would be prospecting holes, but this wasn't mineralized. And it wasn't until years later that I found out that these were where people were digging out walnut stumps. The walnut trees were long gone, but the stumps were durable and valuable. They slice them up, make veneer for high-end furniture and so on. And so that explained that. My next major flight was from home to Ann Arbor, Michigan, where I went to grad school. And it was a 2-day flight, and I could see the weather forecast for the next morning was thunderstorms. So I got up as early as I could, took off, could look back to the west to see lightning strikes back there, but I stayed ahead of the storms. Well, I got transferred into Utah, and I bought another airplane, a Cessna 140, which was, again, a tail dragger, but all metal, 125 horsepower, stealth starter engine. This is a little better photo. Got married and found we weren't flying very much, and if you're flying less than 100 hours a year, it's normally cheaper to rent airplanes than to own your own. So we got rid of the Cessna, but not before flying around the Grand Tetons. Very beautiful flight. I won't give you the English translation of the Grand Tetons, but back when the airline flight attendants were all stewardesses, some of them referred to these as the Sweater Girl Mountains. We rented for a while, and one memorable flight was to Aspen for a weekend of skiing with friends, which became another adventure story for another time. Then eventually moved from Utah to Seattle, and we're coming down off Snoqualmie Pass. I saw a glider in the air, and I'd never seen one. And I was really fascinated, so we stopped at the little airport at Issaquah, now long gone. And I, again, kind of went in to check it out. Before I left, I'd taken a lesson. To be a good pilot, glider pilot, you have to visualize this invisible updraft and position yourself within it, not get outside and circle and get on up. I took lessons in a two-place Schweitzer, and I wasn't very good. I'd lose altitude, and the instructor would say, well, let me have it. In a couple of minutes, he'd have gained a couple thousand feet and say, okay, you can try again. But I eventually got my rating. I was allowed to fly their only single-place glider, another Schweitzer. And I had only one good flight. This was up over Tiger Mountain. There were hawks circling there and an updraft, and I joined them. And I had a good flight. I stayed up about an hour and a half. And when I got down, I got the bum's rush, and I couldn't figure it out. What's going on? And I said, well, that's Ernie Gons. Well, who in the heck is Ernie Gons? Well, I haven't been able to look him up, but he was apparently a guy writing adventure stories about flying. And apparently an excellent glider pilot and a good customer. They told him, well, this guy's a real duffer. He'll be down in 15 minutes or so. But, you know, I had a good flight, and I was up about an hour and a half, and he was really fuming by the time I got back. And they were already hooking a plane up to a tow line. And so that ended that. Well, I quit flying when we were expecting. My wife got nauseous if she went with me. If she didn't, she got panicked that, oh, something might happen. I'll be left as a widow with a young child. So 20 years later, the baby we were expecting was now a college student, and he had this special deal. If we could get 5 people together to go up for skydiving, we'd get a really good cost. So we went out. You know, he thought he had all 5 lined up. Only 2 of us actually showed up. And he had wondered, would you be one of the 5? And I, okay. Well, it was an interesting day, and they taught us how to land, and it was kind of nonsense because it was so gentle, you didn't need to roll or anything. But they taught us how to do that. You know, just a little platform to jump off. So this is how I should have done it. Yeah, he's got it right. And then they taught us how to exit the Lance Piper, the Piper Lance.
Right here.
Which is kind of easy because you weren't looking at the ground. You just rolled out when I told you to go. So less panic.
Here. Now I want you to take this hand when I say go.
It's a lot of video. Some are good shoots, some are not. And so this is up in the air. My son was the first to go. And then I followed him. The wind was a little bit variable, and our son landed too long, and I dropped short because the wind had picked up. I wanted to show you an image of the chute, which is square rather than round chutes that they used in World War II. I don't know what the smoke jumpers are using now. I've kind of wanted to look it up. But these big rectangular chutes are very controllable. And you fly them just like you would an airplane. You make a downwind leg, you turn left onto a base leg, then you turn upwind to your landing. And you land you could do a full stall and you just stand there. You're not even, don't even need to fall. Well, I still fly in my dreams. I'm now in the Luscombe instead of my own airplane or wings. And I have this recurring dream. I don't know if it's some psychological problem or not, But I'm approaching power lines, I'm making a decision, do I fly above them or do I go under them? So far, I've never tangled up. So, any questions or comments?
Thanks, Al. And it looks like you finished just in time because we have a low battery signal. But that's great. You got all the way through it.
Oh, yeah, I forgot to plug it in. I do that once in a while.
Who has a question or a comment for Al? Okay, Frank in the back, and then you.
I just wondered if you had any thoughts about this Chinese balloon that you'd like to share with us.
Yeah, I really do. I see it's just our paranoia. The Chinese said, we've already got spy satellites that are giving us all the information we need. Why would we do something like that? And back in World War II, the Japanese had balloons that dropped incendiary bombs. They'd go up and down, they'd go up to a certain altitude, and that would release a bomb. No, they'd get down to a certain altitude, that'd release a bomb. So they'd go back up, and it would just be doing this, dropping these incendiary bombs. And my dad was involved in a little bit of stuff, and he went out to eastern Colorado to look at one of these that had come down. They tried to keep it secret so that the Japanese wouldn't know that they were doing any damage, because they were hoping to set our forests afire. But I see the balloon as no threat whatsoever, and they could easily just knock it down and inspect what it is. But we're real paranoid. Most of our foreign policy is paranoid.
I think there was a family in Oregon actually got killed by one of those Japanese balloons. Those were the only casualties. It fell down and they examined it or something. They got killed. I noticed the planes that you flew were all tail draggers. It was much easier, I learned on a tricycle gear. The tail dragger is a tougher thing to do. You don't have good visibility, and the ground loops are more likely to happen and so forth. Or you might comment on that.
Yeah, most of the available planes now have tricycle gear.
Yeah.
But they still have flaps, and if you're landing at full flap, you got some of the same issues. Probably the worst incident I ever had, I was flying into Denver, and I got into a wind shear, which was different from what they do in the weather forecast, but the air up here was moving faster than the air at the ground level. And so suddenly I had a big drop in airspeed. And I found I was really dropping fast. I landed at a 3-point attitude with a throttle full blast. Still hit pretty hard, but didn't do any damage. But the local pilots at high altitude fly to the ground. They do wheel landings. Even with tail draggers, they'll have good flying speed, get the wheels on the ground solidly, and then shut the engine down.
To make his flight across the Atlantic, do you give Lindbergh a great deal of credit for his work with Ryan to design his airplane?
Yeah, I don't know the history carefully, but apparently he got involved in the design. And as I recall, they had gas tanks up front blocking the forward division. So he was looking forward with mirrors and so on. And like these other folks, he was a gutsy person doing something that had pretty high risk with it. Interestingly, the pilot of these human-powered things was a gutsy guy. By the end of the Albatross flight, he had run out of water, his legs were cramping, and they had computed the maximum endurance he could possibly have and found that his flight was within a couple of minutes of that.
Any more? Al, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for all this. That's great. Make it silent.